The ranch lay quiet under the fading light, the great Wyoming sky stretching endless and heavy above the land. Only the sound of a newborn's cry broke the silence, thin and desperate, echoing through the log house. Inside, John Carter sat hunched in a chair near the fire, his strong hands trembling as he tried to cradle the fragile life that was his son. His shirt was damp with sweat, his face lined deeper than his years, his eyes hollowed by grief. Beside the bed, the blankets lay still, and the body of the woman he had loved more than life itself was covered with a sheet. He had buried her the day before with his own 2 hands, digging until his muscles tore and the earth gave way. Mary, the only woman who had ever dared to tame his restless soul, had given him this child at the cost of her own breath. Now John sat alone, his arms aching as much from holding the baby as from holding back the storm of grief that threatened to undo him. The infant cried again, and John, rough rancher that he was, whispered a broken plea for silence, rocking back and forth as if rhythm could mend what death had torn. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Abigail Turner stepped inside without asking. She had been the town's matchmaker for decades, a firm but kind woman with iron gray hair pinned tightly at the back of her head, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She had visited often during Mary's illness, always urging John to accept help, always hinting at what he refused to hear. She paused in the doorway, her gaze lingering on the bundled infant, then on the weary father. "I told you you needed a wife," she said softly, not with cruelty, but with a conviction as steady as the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. John lifted his head, his jaw tightening as if her words were stones thrown at an open wound. "I had one," he rasped, his voice breaking. "And I lost her." His arms tightened around the child, as though he could hold on to Mary through the fragile weight she had left behind. Mrs. Turner stepped closer, her boots thudding gently on the wooden floor. She laid a hand on his shoulder, firm as a mother's would be. "You had a good woman, John. God rest her soul, but this child needs more than a grieving father with calloused hands. He needs milk, gentleness, a woman's care. And you," her eyes softened, though her voice did not falter, "you need someone to keep you from drowning in that sorrow." John shook his head, his throat tightening. "No one could take her place. No one will," the matchmaker agreed. "But someone can stand beside you, for the child's sake if not your own." Mary would not want her son to grow up without a mother's touch. The firelight flickered over John's face, revealing the war inside him. He had fought storms, wolves, drought, and fire, but this was the enemy he could not reckon with. His strength was useless against the gnawing ache of grief and the soft, insistent cries of the babe. The baby whimpered again, and Mrs. Turner, with gentle authority, lifted the child from his arms. She moved with the skill of one who had held countless little ones, her touch calming the restless body. The cries softened, and John felt both relief and shame, for it seemed even the life he had fathered could find comfort more easily in another's arms. "You're not weak for needing help," she said, her gaze never leaving the baby's small face. "Even the strongest man cannot live by himself when a child depends on him. And I know just the woman, a widow herself, strong, gentle, and no stranger to hardship. She'll not try to replace Mary. She'll only help you raise this boy and keep your house from falling into ruin." John rose slowly, his broad frame towering over the matchmaker, yet he felt smaller than he ever had. His voice was hoarse. "And what if I can't bear it, seeing another woman in Mary's place, standing where she once stood?" Mrs. Turner looked up at him with the wisdom of years etched in her face. "Then you'll bear it for the sake of the child. Love can come again, John, even if it looks different. But first, you must open the door you've nailed shut. God gave you a son, and with him, a reason to go on. Do not let that gift slip through your fingers because of pride or fear." The room fell silent, save for the crackle of the fire. John looked at the baby, at the small fist curled tight against the blanket, at the life that depended on him and would one day carry his name. Something in his chest loosened, though it was bound with grief still. He swallowed hard, his rough hands flexing at his sides. "You'll send for her?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Turner's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I already have." John sank back into the chair, his eyes fixed on his son. He felt the hollow ache of loss, but beneath it, the faint stirrings of something else, something like hope, fragile and trembling, yet alive. The fire burned low, and in its glow, the widowed rancher sat cradling his newborn, no longer alone in the silence. The Wyoming sky stretched wide and eternal, its fading light falling heavy across the land. The wind carried the smell of hay and dust, brushing over the weathered timbers of the Carter Ranch house. From inside came a sound that seemed to break the quiet world apart, a newborn's cry, thin and sharp, echoing like grief itself. John Carter sat by the fire, his massive shoulders hunched, his strong hands trembling as they struggled to cradle the small bundle in his arms. He was a man built by the land, broad of chest, his skin tanned and rough, his eyes the color of storm clouds, but tonight he looked fragile, hollowed out. His shirt clung damp with sweat, and every breath dragged through him like it carried the weight of stone. Across the room, the bed was still, too still. The woman who had once brought laughter into the house, whose hands had stitched curtains and whose voice had sung soft lullabies before the child ever came, lay beneath a shroud of blankets. Mary had given everything she had to bring forth their son, and the price was her life. John had dug her grave with his own hands. His palms were raw, his back bent, his body near collapse by the time he covered her in earth. He had not wept when the preacher spoke the last words. His tears had not come then, nor when the neighbors left their casseroles and condolences. Only now, holding the infant whose cries pierced the silence, did the storm of grief threaten to break. The baby squirmed, his tiny fists waving against the air, his face red with hunger and confusion. John whispered something raw and desperate, rocking back and forth, as though his rough rhythm could comfort what he could not feed. The door opened. Mrs. Abigail Turner did not knock. She never did. She had walked into more homes than any preacher or doctor in town. With her came the smell of lavender soap and the crisp authority of a woman who had raised 6 children and married off half the county. She was the town's matchmaker, and she carried that title as a rancher carried a branding iron, firmly, decisively. Her sharp eyes took in the room, lingering on the still bed, then on the man hunched like a mountain breaking under its own weight. Finally, her gaze landed on the child. She closed the door softly behind her. "I told you you needed a wife," she said, her voice neither cruel nor mocking, but as certain as the ticking of the clock on the mantel. John's head snapped up, his jaw tightening. "I had one," he rasped, his voice breaking. "And I lost her." Mrs. Turner stepped closer, her boots tapping softly on the worn floorboards. She did not flinch at his tone, nor at the storm brewing in his eyes. She laid a firm hand on his shoulder, as immovable as the land itself. "You had a good woman, John. God rest her soul, but this child needs more than a grieving father with calloused hands. He needs milk, warmth, a woman's touch. And you," she leveled her gaze on him, "you need someone to keep you from drowning in that sorrow." John's hands clutched the baby tighter, his voice hoarse. "No one could take her place. No one. No one will," the matchmaker replied firmly. "But someone can stand beside you. Someone who knows loss as you do. Someone who won't try to erase Mary's memory, but will help you raise this boy so he grows with more than silence and sorrow." The firelight danced across his weary face. John stared at his son, his chest aching with a love so fierce it terrified him. He had fought droughts, wolves, and wildfires, but none of it had prepared him for this, holding a life so small, so helpless, and knowing it depended on him alone. The baby whimpered again, restless and hungry. Mrs. Turner bent down and, with the surety of a woman who had raised her share, lifted the infant from John's arms. Her hands were practiced, steady, her voice low and soothing. The child's cries softened against her chest, and John felt the sting of shame. Even his own son found comfort more easily in another's arms. "You're not weak for needing help," she said, her eyes still on the child. "Even the strongest man cannot carry this alone. And I know just the woman. A widow herself. She's strong, she's kind, and she knows the ache of loss. She won't try to step into Mary's shoes. She'll only stand beside you." John rose, his broad frame shadowing hers, but inside he felt smaller than ever. His voice was raw, stripped bare. "And if I can't bear it, if seeing another woman in this house tears me apart, Mrs. Turner looked up, her eyes steady, her gray hair gleaming in the firelight. "Then you'll bear it for your son. Mary would want him to have a mother's touch. And God himself never intended man to fight his battles alone. You've carried grief as far as a man can. Let someone else carry it with you." For a long moment, only the crackle of fire filled the room. John's gaze dropped to the child in her arms, to the small fist curled tightly against the blanket, to the fragile breath that carried the weight of Mary's last gift. His chest ached, but beneath the grief, a faint stirring, something he hadn't felt since before the fever took Mary, rose within him. "You'll send for her." His voice was barely above a whisper. Mrs. Turner's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I already have. 3 days later, the sun rose bright and harsh, baking the earth until the air shimmered. John Carter stood by the corral, his hat pulled low, his hands restless against the fence rail. In the house, his son slept under Mrs. Turner's watchful care. The world felt wrong without Mary, every board of the house echoing her absence. Yet today, something else tugged at him, a weight of expectation, of change he had not asked for but could not stop. A wagon crested the ridge, its wheels rattling over the dry earth. A single horse pulled it, and beside the driver's seat sat a woman. Her figure was straight, her dress plain but neat, her hair tied back against the wind. As the wagon drew closer, John saw her face, lined not by years, but by hardship. She was not young, not fragile, not the kind of woman the world called pretty. Yet there was strength in the set of her jaw, a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. Her name was Clara Dawson, Mrs. Turner had said, a widow from Nebraska who had buried a husband and 2 children in the same year. She had come west to escape the ghosts of her own land, carrying nothing but a trunk and a Bible. When the wagon stopped, Clara climbed down herself, her boots raising dust. She looked John square in the eye, her voice steady. "Mr. Carter." He tipped his hat, his throat tight. "Ma'am." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the restless snort of the horse. 2 people bound by loss, strangers on the same unforgiving land. Neither spoke of what had been arranged, of what Mrs. Turner had pushed into motion. Finally, Clara glanced toward the house. "May I see the child?" John hesitated. Then he nodded. Inside, the air was cool and dim. Mrs. Turner rose from her chair, the baby in her arms, and offered a knowing smile as she handed the infant to Clara. Clara's hands moved with a tenderness that surprised John. She cradled the boy as though he were her own, her lips brushing against his downy head, her eyes softening for the first time since she arrived. John watched, his chest tightening. The sight both comforted and unsettled him. It was Mary he saw when he thought of a mother's arms around his child. Yet here was another woman, her grief as deep as his, offering a gentleness he could not. Mrs. Turner looked between them, her smile faint but certain. "You'll manage," she said. "Both of you." The days that followed Clara Dawson's arrival were quiet, but not easy. John Carter had thought grief was his only burden. He discovered quickly that living alongside another person, especially a stranger, was its own trial. Clara moved through the house with a sure, steady hand. She took to the baby as though he were flesh of her flesh, waking in the night to feed him, walking the floor when his cries echoed through the rafters. She mended the curtains Mary had left half-stitched, swept the dust from corners John had not noticed, and filled the air with the low hum of hymns sung under her breath. John, for his part, found himself a shadow in his own home. He tended the stock, mended fences, split wood, and worked until sweat stung his eyes. Yet always, when he returned, there was Clara, rocking the baby, her strong hands moving with gentleness he could not match. The boy settled for her more easily than for him, and that gnawed at John's heart like hunger. One evening, after a long day in the fields, he came in to find Clara at the table, the child lying on her lap. She was sewing by lamplight, the baby quiet against her arm. John paused in the doorway, his throat tightening. For an instant, the scene looked too much like what he had lost. Mary had sat that way countless evenings, stitching, humming, rocking their child before he was even born. The sight made his chest ache with both comfort and pain. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his. She must have read the storm in his face, for she spoke quietly. "I'm not trying to take her place, Mr. Carter." John stiffened. "I know." Her gaze softened, though her voice held steady. "You think I don't see it in your eyes? The way you look at me as if I'm trespassing in her shadow. I buried a husband, and 2 children with him. I know what it means to love and lose. I wouldn't dishonor Mary by pretending to be her." John's hands tightened on the back of a chair. He had no words to answer. Finally, he sank into the seat, his voice low. "I just don't know how to let anyone close again. It feels like betrayal, even standing in the same room with you." Clara's needle stilled. The lamp flame flickered, casting light across her worn features. "Then don't think of it as letting me close to you. Think of it as letting me close to him." She looked down at the baby, who had drifted into sleep. "He needs more than one pair of arms. If I can give him that, then that is enough." Her words settled into him like rain on dry earth. For the first time, John saw her not as an intruder, but as a woman carrying her own grief, offering what strength she had left for the sake of a child not her own. The summer deepened. The land demanded work unending, and John bent himself to it with renewed purpose. But now, when he returned home, it was not silence that greeted him. Clara's voice, low and steady, filled the rooms. Sometimes he found her humming to the baby, sometimes reading from her Bible, sometimes laughing softly when the child reached for her hair. The house no longer felt like a tomb. Yet still, John held himself apart. He ate at the table with her, spoke when necessary, but kept his heart locked tight. He did not know if it was pride, fear, or loyalty to Mary that made him resist the warmth creeping into his days. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains. The wind howled, rattling shutters and shaking the roof. Rain pounded against the windows, and the baby cried, restless with the fury outside. Clara tried to soothe him, but when she laid him down, the child wailed louder. John took the boy into his arms, pacing the floor with heavy steps. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm within him. He rocked the child, whispering rough words, his voice breaking. "Hush, son, hush now. I'm here, your pa here." But the cries did not cease. Clara rose, stepping close. Without a word, she laid her hand over John's on the blanket. The touch startled him, but her eyes held no pity, only strength. Together, they cradled the child. The boy quieted, his sobs softening until only the rain filled the silence. When John looked at Clara, something in him shifted. For months he had held himself apart, clinging to grief like armor. But here, in the storm's fury, he felt for the first time that he was not carrying the weight alone. "Thank you," he whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep. Clara nodded, her hand lingering for a moment longer before she drew back. He's not just yours anymore, John. He's ours to keep alive. The word ours echoed in him long after the storm passed. Dash, dash, dash. The months that followed bound them together in ways John had not expected. They faced a dry spell that threatened the crops, a coyote raid on the chicken coop, a fever that laid the baby low for 3 terrifying nights. Through it all, Clara stood steadfast. She rose before dawn, worked beside him in the fields when he needed extra hands, and never faltered when hardship pressed hard. One night, after the fever finally broke and the baby slept peacefully, John found Clara on the porch, staring at the stars. He stepped outside, the night air cool against his skin. For a moment, he stood in silence, then spoke. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. She glanced at him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "Do what? Live without her? Let you in? Feel something other than grief?" His voice cracked. "Every time I start to breathe again, it feels like I'm leaving Mary behind." Clara's gaze did not waver. "You don't leave her behind by living. You honor her. Grief doesn't mean you stop. It means you carry her love into what comes next." She looked back at the sky, her voice soft. "I carry my children with me every day. They're gone, but I live so their memory isn't wasted. You can do the same." John's chest ached. He wanted to argue, but the truth in her words sank too deep. Slowly, almost without realizing it, he reached for her hand. She did not pull away. Their fingers twined together, rough and calloused, yet steady. It was not the thunder of passion that sparked between them, but the quiet strength of 2 souls scarred by loss, choosing, hesitantly, tremblingly, to walk forward together. Dash, dash, dash. By the time the first snow dusted the plains, John Carter was no longer the man who had sat hollow-eyed by the fire months before. He was still a widower. He still spoke Mary's name at night when he laid his son down. But he was no longer alone. Clara's presence filled the house with warmth, and her laughter, rare but true, began to sound like music. One evening, as they stood by the crib watching the child sleep, John turned to her. His voice was low, steady. "I thought I'd never say this again, but I need you, Clara. Not just for him, for me." Tears shone in her eyes, but her smile was soft. "Then we'll stand together, John. Not to replace what we lost, but to build what we still have." He took her into his arms, not as a man desperate to fill a void, but as one who had finally learned that love, in its truest form, is not replaced. It is carried, reshaped, reborn. The wind whispered against the walls, the fire burned low, and in the quiet of that winter night, the widowed rancher and the matchmaker's chosen bride found what both thought they had lost forever. Not the end of grief, but the beginning of hope. And in the cradle between them, their son slept on, his small chest rising and falling with the promise of a future no longer shadowed by sorrow.